welcome, and very lovely to see everybody here. And may I add my welcome to the day as well. Part of the reason for today has arisen from an event that took place almost exactly a year ago in Collett House in London, called Evolving Consciousness. I'm just going to put the talks for that in the chat now, actually, which are online for your perusal later on. And we drew a lot there from the ideas of Owen Barfield, and particularly his idea that our experience of being human shifts and changes over time. And this day, in a way, is to pick up on that and see whether we can develop what Barfield called final participation, what he also referred to as becoming aware of the inside of the whole world, overcoming the loss of meaning and alienation which many experience, and realizing that that self is part of a wider process. It's to move beyond Flatland, to use the title of our day today. Our speakers will speak about many different things, but there's a kind of thread picking up from last year, taking things on, we hope, which might make sense to some of you who were there last year. In this first session, I'm going to say a little bit more about all that. Then Angela Voss, who's a very brilliant teacher of the Western esoteric traditions, particularly Neoplatonism, will begin to unpack this business of moving beyond Flatland for us in relation to that. And David Lorimer, who many will know is the program director of the Scientific and Medical Network and editor of the essential reading Paradigm Explorer, because of all the books that it covers apart from anything else. He will pick that up in the third part of this first hour as well. But I'm going to start speaking first of all, just to say a little bit more about, in a way, what I hope you might find from this day. The metaphor Flatland comes from the Victorian novella by Edwin Abbott. He wrote it actually with quite a social critique in mind, but it's come to stand for the experience of feeling you live maybe in a two-dimensional or three-dimensional world, and every so often having intimations that there are further dimensions. And what's so fascinating about this is that these further dimensions both have a kind of allure. You want to know more about them, but they can be quite frightening. They can crash in because coming from a higher dimension, it's hard to comprehend them when you're in the lower dimensions, when that's the average consciousness, the usual experience of the world. But nonetheless, they're really crucial, I think, for our sense of reality. They're what we yearn for. And I think when we don't know how to try and connect, communicate, resonate, harmonize with them, we're likely to abuse the dimensions that we do understand. So today is partly about personal transformation, but I think it also is very much about our times and how, particularly in a highly consumer world, part of our trouble is that we've lost touch with the full riches, the full wealth, the full glory of which we're capable as human beings. So it matters socially as well as personally. The idea for today as well, the sort of focus for it, came from a second area that increasingly concerns me actually, which is the sense that being trapped in Flatland is not just something that many people experience, but you notice it even in spiritual circles. I think there's a lot of confusion about how to participate in spiritual dimensions of reality. You see it, for example, when in personal transformation, the language of technology starts to shape what people feel they're undergoing in their spiritual quests, psychotechnologies. The machine metaphor starts to not just be used, but I think to constrain what becomes possible. You see it too in the way that the language of science is co-opted to somehow give credibility to spiritual quests, which really not only should have credibility on their own, but actually many of the early scientists used spiritual perceptions to understand the science. So for example, the unity that's experienced in the quantum world originally came from a spiritual perception of that unity, used to understand quantum reality as it was beginning to show itself. And I think it's sort of flipped often now it's often regarded as if quantum reality proves spiritual perceptions, when really it should be the other way round. I think you feel it in ecological confusions as well, not just because if we're not careful, we end up consuming the earth looking for true wealth, true glory, true reality. But we can, as it were, crash heaven and try and make it a place on earth. And that brings about all sorts of dangers to do with utopias, or spiritual messages getting too confused with social concerns. We need a sort of more expansive view of things so that there's room for this all, and not reducing things to narrower concerns. I think you see it in psychological confusions when, for example, the imagination is regarded as if it's just fanciful, as if it helps us perhaps by illuminating our lives, representing things to us, rather than what I hope you will discover today, being a channel and passageway into a wider truth itself, the so-called imaginal itself. It is a truth-bearing capacity we have, and to expand it back into that awareness, I hope will be part of today. You see the confusion too in metaphysical concerns. You know, a lot of the discussion about consciousness gets caught up in this. Is consciousness something that emerges, or is it actually something which was always already there, unfolding and manifesting and showing, diversifying itself in us to be gathered up into a great return? That would be the traditional, certainly Neoplatonic view. And it's useful to have all these possibilities in front of you when you're considering what the spiritual dimension is, what it is to move beyond Flatland. So it's partly to address some of these concerns that I hope today might be useful. A way of summing this up in a third sense is that, in a way, I think we've lost what you might call a kind of spiritual intelligence. Now, spiritual intelligence is very different from the other kinds of intelligence that sort of do the rounds in our public discourse. It's very different from artificial intelligence, which has its uses, but it's mostly about, you might say, decision-making or problem-solving. I think spiritual intelligence is also different from emotional intelligence. You know, emotional intelligence is about understanding experiences, understanding relationships. But spiritual intelligence is different from that. And it's even different, I think, from having a purpose or meaning or knowing something of happiness in your life, though it may bring those things as a kind of byproduct. Because I think ultimately what spiritual intelligence is about is a clear perception of the ontological ground of life. Now that ground is known by many names. It might be God, it might be emptiness, it might be Brahman, it might be the self with a capital S. It's that which is beyond us, but it's beyond us because it's the reality within which we live, move, and have our being. And spiritual intelligence knows that as the most basic intuition of its awareness, and from which all other awarenesses springs. You know, it's why mystics like Meister Eckhart can say that my eye and God's eye is one eye and one sight and one knowledge and one love, but incidentally also know that he's not God, even though he's invited to share in that divine life. And you see similar remarks made by the great mystics of other traditions right around the world. It's the heart, you might say, of the perennial philosophy. And I hope that something of that will be possible to explore today, this kind of inside of the whole world, as Barfield put it, that can communicate to us, that offers its grace if we can tune into it and know how to incorporate that sensibility into our own lives. Now, another element of today, which I hope will provide chance to consider, is that this spiritual intelligence can be very hard. And the reason why it's tricky is that it requires self-knowledge. It requires an understanding of yourself. So in a way, you can see more than yourself. You can know that I am more than I am, as Dante put it in the Divine Comedy. And this becomes difficult because it often requires periods of breakdown or grappling with uncertainty, and certainly addressing your own shadows so that you don't inadvertently project them onto others. If you do that, the great risk is that you actually diminish yourself. You lose the full sense of yourself, which brings confusion, but also means that you're not bringing the whole of your soul, your complete self, as Jung put it, to this great task of becoming more aligned and aware of the spiritual ground of all being. It's about leaning into pain and death even sometimes, and realizing that there's a quality of existence that's more reliable and actually holds those things within itself, as is sometimes put by the Buddhists. The obstacles are the way. But that is hard. It's easy to say, but often very tricky to do. And I hope that some sense of that might come out today as well. It's a crucial part, I think, of this transformative way of knowing. So, you know, we need to see more than Flatland, but because it's this dynamic process, it's the very business of being alive, we also need access to living traditions, dynamic traditions, you might say, not just rules and doctrines, which also means that we need teachers, both in the past and in the present. And that is difficult too, because it brings risks of exploitation. We can become confused in ourselves. It can be hard to know who to turn to. And I hope that some of that might come up as well today. But of course, the promise is becoming aware of that which is constant and ultimately sure. And really, at the end of the day, there is a sense where you can't go wrong, because that reality is always already there. It's the reason why we're engaging with this at all. And so there's a bit of trust that can be had in that, even through some of these difficulties. So look, I hope that today will give you a feel for this, both practically actually, as well as philosophically. Both are really key actually to bring both aspects together, because it's about a knowing that is at once felt in the heart, but is also discerned by the mind. It's about finding the narrow path and tracking that down. The day will be quite a smorgasbord. We've sort of designed it to give lots of tastes, as well as moments actually when there will be a chance to sink into a practice or an exercise in a little bit more of a sustained way, but perhaps inevitably combining with Zoom, that's going to have its limitations. So, you know, listen into all that's said. And my advice is to pick up the things that speak to you directly, because often that will be resonating with the part of yourself that's ready to receive something. Sometimes that can be actually the more difficult parts, as well as the more hopeful parts. So listen with that open mind to what's said, enjoy what's said, and pick up the things that might be speaking to you more directly. Do you know, I was just listening to something that the Pope had written this morning, a rare, I think, religious leader who actually has real spiritual nous for all the difficulties that he also faces in the Catholic Church. And he was remarking that we need to recover our contemplative capacities to know life in all its fullness, because we don't have that. We will just go on madly consuming the earth. And the good news about all this is that the divine loves our desire. It loves our intellect. It loves our intuition. It loves our imagination and our feeling. It loves, and as the Sufis say, the divine was a hidden treasure. So I hope today that amidst all the tangles and difficulties of the present day, you can feel some of that treasure which lies beyond Flatland and the